Welcome, my name is Alex Bernat. Today I'm going to be giving a presentation on the basics of the regenerative currency system model. Let's dive in. This presentation will provide a general overview of regenerative currency systems. It won't cover every detail, but you should leave having a solid concept of what regenerative currencies are and why they matter. You should also walk away with a basic understanding of how this model works and how you can learn more if you're interested. So I'm Alex Bernat. My pronouns are they and them, and I'm the originating creator of the regenerative currency system model. So what is a regenerative currency? Regenerative currencies are financial assets that represent and measure essential and prioritized forms of value. I'll explain this much more as we go along, but regenerative currencies are an answer to the question, what happens if we make currencies that are actually backed by the common good? Now, if we're going to talk about backing a currency with the common good, we have to talk about what we actually choose to value. And it's very important to recognize that many real forms of value are temporary. They're subject to entropy. Real value consistently needs to be reintroduced, and the same is true of a regenerative currency. Regenerative currencies constantly recycle a small percentage of their own value out of circulation, so that new assets can continuously be introduced without causing inflation. And what's exciting about this is it allows us to measure fixed units of real value using a currency, where even temporary forms of value can back a currency at a fixed strength. I can explain this more as we go deeper, but it is a really exciting property of regenerative currencies. And while most essential forms of value are temporary, many are also untradeable. Some examples are public health, social equity, and biodiversity. We need these forms of value to survive, but they're externalities to conventional financial systems in the sense that you can't own them or trade them, and a conventional economy can't allow you to financially profit from prioritizing them. Because regenerative currencies enter circulation as real value is introduced, and because they leave circulation as real value is lost, these assets can provide community-wide financial benefits when real conditions improve, and they can provide community-wide financial consequences when real conditions are degraded. These currencies let you hold a financial stake in the common good. And this is where things get really exciting. If you directly issue new regenerative currency assets into the possession of the people who are providing essential work and producing essential value, they can get paid without there being any private cost. And if you define meeting basic needs as being innately valuable in a system like this, you can pay the providers of basic goods and services while lowering the basic cost of survival to zero. Without eliminating commerce, you can completely eliminate poverty. Now, the poverty line itself, our financial experience of poverty, is composed of repeated mandatory costs. And these costs are mandatory because human need fulfillment is temporary. We ourselves are subject to entropy. And by introducing media of exchange that mirror entropy, we can eliminate the basic cost of survival. I believe that financial poverty stems from our financial system's inability to mirror the properties of real systems, including entropy. And by creating currencies that slowly decay out of circulation, you can measure real value in its production by the production of financial value. When there's more wealth in a material, actualized form, the community can have more financial wealth as well. These assets make it possible to define essential priorities and to fund those priorities completely, simply by making financial assets that represent the things we truly choose to value. Now, we live in a world where basic work needs to be done, period. So how does this take place? How is this motivated in an economy where basic survival is free? New assets of a regenerative currency are designed to be introduced as payment into the possession of basic providers who complete essential work. These providers could be publicly employed, or they might be private businesses and individuals. This model is designed to be flexible enough to be implemented in either public or privatized solutions. And when the public accepts a regenerative currency in meaningful exchanges at appropriate prices, it empowers these essential workers. The public acceptance of a regenerative currency is what determines its usability. When more people accept these assets for meaningful products and services, more basic providers can sustainably offer more of their work without cost. Commerce itself then becomes the engine for eliminating poverty and protecting our collective well-being. And this model will only be capable of scaling to a point that matches its level of public acceptance and the level of commerce that is taking place. A less accepted regenerative currency may only fund partial support, like a couple free meals per week, and this might only be possible to offer to a small number of individuals who are experiencing extremely high levels of need, while a more widely accepted regenerative currency could provide entire communities with access to basic support. Making money would still be financially rewarding in this system. You could get meaningful goods and services for your wealth. But participation within commerce can simultaneously be motivated by the knowledge that doing so will help to support the long-term well-being of your community. Instead of being just something you do to make ends meet, making money could represent the ongoing act of supporting your community's and the global community's well-being and security. Later I'll touch more on how this can be done without causing inflation and without destabilizing existing public funding solutions. But before getting into the weeds and diving into the details, I believe it's really important to clarify why I suggest using new currencies at all. In particular, why we should introduce new currencies when we already have highly established systems of exchange, and when we already have many options for improving our public policies and our financial practices. So why should we add a complex new ingredient into the mix? Because I believe the issue is actually systemic. I argue that chronic poverty is produced simply by using conventional media of exchange within survival-level markets. So this is a pretty bold claim, and it will have to be scrutinized and verified by many credible experts with many different perspectives, but it is at the core of why I suggest the regenerative currency system model. I argue that economic homeostasis takes place in a way that is similar to biological homeostasis. Passive, systemic processes in our bodies preserve a balanced state of health. And if our body temperature, our blood sugar, the level of salt in our blood changes, it triggers automatic responses in a healthy human body that passively and systemically reestablish a state of equilibrium. And we know that our economies exert a similar set of passive systemic pressures that maintain a balance between supply and demand. This allows production to be more lucrative when there's high public demand, and it causes prices to drop when fewer purchases are taking place relative to the available supply of tradable value. Now, this is a powerful, passive, and decentralized process, and it has served many people quite well. But I also argue that this equilibrium, this constant balance between supply and demand, will always optimize towards a state of partial scarcity. If production was to take place to the full extent that it was needed, prices would drop too low for production to continue. But what about all the solutions that we have in existing systems? We have many ways that we can change our financial policies. We have many ways that we can improve our public welfare. But I argue that even when meaningful progress is made towards eliminating poverty in existing systems, supply and demand will subsequently exert passive, systemic forces that drive conventional economies towards preserving chronic poverty. And many conventional tools for relieving poverty can even cause inflation. Anytime taxes are used to fund essential work, it raises mandatory costs, and these costs get passed forward through higher prices. And whenever the public has more money to spend on equivalent purchases, perhaps because they gain access to higher wages, broader employment, or a basic income, those purchases can and eventually will become more expensive. Consider the fact that everybody in the world could burn half of their money in a big bonfire tonight, and prices could, and eventually would, simply lower to half of what they've previously been, and nobody would have lost any wealth at all. And give everybody twice their existing level of wealth in a big payday from the sky, and prices would double without anybody becoming any richer. Now, if you give even a massive amount of wealth to those who are currently facing poverty, it will be their purchases that become more expensive. Within conventional systems, anytime wealth enters the hands of marginalized communities, the poverty line will become higher. Take a step towards the finish line, and the finish line gets one step further away. So what does this mean? It means that scarcity and shortages are simply profitable in existing systems. Markets are conventionally considered to be healthiest when prices are high, but this also reflects a high poverty line. And not only are these shortages profitable within existing systems, but it's conventionally impossible for producers to even afford to provide enough survival level value to completely eliminate outstanding need, because that would eliminate demand for their own work, and it would eliminate the prices that they can receive for it. This can't happen in reality. So instead, our existing systems cease to produce more whenever we reach this point. Regardless of the effectiveness of other interventions, there will always be partial scarcity when supply and demand are used to mediate the production of essential value. We need new tools. In existing systems, relieving poverty and protecting social and ecological well-being, even the basic survival of our planet as a living system, will always come at a financial cost relative to the profit that can be gained by preserving patterns of poverty and exclusion and scarcity. I believe that it is essential that we introduce new systemic tools that prevent these patterns from taking place, to make it not just possible, but profitable to eliminate poverty and protect natural systems. This is what regenerative currency systems are designed to do. What we need is a new set of ways to provide universal basic access to well-being. This is a proposed goal of providing free, population-wide access to all components of a reasonable baseline of well-being. Nobody would be required to utilize these forms of support, but everybody would have access, as much as needed, and whenever it is needed. Regenerative currency systems are made so that they could be introduced alongside and within existing systems, which is an important part of their design as a way to provide this kind of universal basic access to well-being. This is a system where all truly essential costs, including those that sustain the basic survival of a population and the basic survival of the planet, are covered entirely within separate mechanisms that are not subject to the exclusionary pressures that supply and demand produce. So how can we do this? By introducing these currencies that are actually backed by the completion of essential work. When essential work is completed, new regenerative currency assets can be issued directly into the possession of relevant providers, and the standard units for a regenerative currency can be tied directly to a number of average daily needs that have been filled. This allows fixed rates of payment to be made towards the completion of need-fulfilling work, which prevents arbitrary inflation within all of the most essential activities. This prevention of inflation would be impossible in conventional economies because conventional currencies have fixed circulating supplies. Therefore, they cannot adjust the ratio between real value and financial value enough to control the strength of the assets. But in a regenerative currency system, this can be done. As more real value is present in circulation, and as more commerce is taking place, it can be appropriate for the supply of a regenerative currency to become larger. And as real value is lost, the supply can become smaller, maintaining a fixed strength for these assets that is appropriate for funding essential work. Now, it is incredibly important to pay attention to how this supply scaling takes place, because this is how a regenerative currency system prevents inflation. Regenerative currency systems are designed to scale with the size of participating groups. Each person with access to currency-generating support corresponds with a specific number of assets that are targeted in circulation, and this per-participant number of assets slowly decays in a way that passively balances the ongoing introduction of sufficient funding to maintain that person's well-being. At the same time, this per-participant supply target can be designed to be appropriate relative to an average person's anticipated level of commercial activity. This can preserve the strength of these assets for any number of people in a way that scales along with providing essential support to everybody as much as is needed. Also, because access to currency-generating support is what determines whether someone is counted as a participant in this way, their per-participant supply target will leave circulation if the system fails to meet their needs. This makes it financially incentivized to preserve and provide ongoing equitable support to the full extent that it is needed. For an indefinite period of time and for an indefinite number of people, this mechanism can make it profitable and sustainable to provide universal basic access to well-being. So now we have a flexible, adaptable, scalable framework for providing universal basic access to well-being, eliminating poverty and funding essential work. And I believe that it's possible to add a few properties to regenerative currencies to make it so that they also allow you to hold a financial stake in untradeable forms of social and ecological well-being. Wealth longevity is the mechanism I propose for allowing stakeholders in a regenerative currency system to experience a financial benefit personally when real conditions improve community-wide. All assets of a regenerative currency would be slowly losing a small percentage of their current value at the same rate as all others at any given time, but I believe that this rate itself can be designed to change in a system-wide way based upon real conditions, and a person's income will then retain its usable value for the longest period of time when communities and ecosystems are the most secure. There are two key ways that I suggest linking the longevity of a regenerative currency with real conditions. The first is data backing. This is a mechanism for using actual data to automatically adjust the number of regenerative currency assets that are targeted in circulation relative to the average recipient of support. Now, if you remember, rates of currency generation are fixed relative to the fulfillment of an average person's daily needs. So increasing the targeted number of assets in circulation relative to the average person can also allow these assets to be longer lived. Basically, when quantifiable data show that real communities and ecosystems are more secure, the average stakeholder in a regenerative currency system can be wealthier. And any inflation that might otherwise come from this kind of increase in public wealth can be balanced by the fact that the regenerative currency assets would also become more savable as they become longer lived, exerting less pressure towards being spent in the short term. The second way to adjust wealth longevity in this model is to generate adaptive funding towards as-needed work while still targeting the same number of assets in circulation overall. Higher levels of need would require higher levels of currency generation, which would make these assets shorter-lived when patterns of outstanding need are most prevalent. In turn, this could allow it to be profitable for all stakeholders to prioritize social and ecological well-being. What's perhaps most exciting about this approach to wealth longevity is that it makes it possible to eliminate economic externalities. What I mean by this is that communities could passively cover the costs of their own negative impacts instead of introducing added costs for external groups, marginalized populations, or future generations. In existing financial systems, many very real mandatory costs are externalized. It can currently be perfectly profitable to exploit untradeable value like an employee's well-being, or the drinkability of water, or the basic ability for life to continue on planet Earth in the name of financial income or of maximizing the production of tradable forms of value. But these negative impacts have actual financial consequences, even if these costs are being passed on to others. Any business model that cannot cover these costs itself is actually producing a net loss within economic health overall, because somebody still has to compensate for the negative impacts that are being produced. Instead of passing externalized costs along, a regenerative currency systems community could be capable of adaptively addressing the impacts it produces, making it actually most profitable to truly benefit and protect social, ecological, and economic well-being. So now we have a model for eliminating poverty, protecting natural systems, and producing passive systemic pressures that make it financially beneficial to prioritize long-term systemic well-being. Awesome. But it's theoretical. What would this look like in application? So one of the questions that will immediately come up around any digital currency is the question of who has the power, who's going to be making the decisions. This model is designed to be broad enough to be applicable at different levels of scale and scope, so the leadership behind any corresponding currencies and platforms might vary widely, but any regenerative currency is also designed to only be usable if it is trusted and preferred by the larger population. One way that this takes place is through the scaling process of a regenerative currency's supply. Because it only scales relative to the average participant, I believe that allowing participants to have choice about which regenerative currency systems they are counted within as a participant can allow them to invest their trust free of cost, so that even the most marginalized populations can decide which implementations of this model they prefer. And if you accept a regenerative currency in meaningful exchanges at a meaningful price, you empower that particular currency to be more usable for providers. This allows businesses and private individuals to invest their trust in a decentralized way. So even though this model could be applied in many diverse ways by many diverse groups and different models of leadership, I believe that it will always be dependent upon public choice and public trust. And how would regenerative currencies be used? This is actually relatively simple. Regenerative currencies could be used in the same way as you use conventional digital forms of existing currencies. Cards, apps, online payments, online bank accounts. This sort of experience would be relatively unchanged while using a regenerative currency. And what work does a regenerative currency system fund? Now this is key. A regenerative currency should be issued only into the possession of basic providers who perform tasks that are an essential part of maintaining a targeted minimum baseline of social and ecological well-being. These systems would best be used to fund the work that would one way or another already be a mandatory part of reaching a targeted baseline of social and ecological well-being. For all other components of commercial activity, elective purchases could take place using a regenerative currency, and prices would still vary based upon the quality and desirability of whatever's being purchased. The value of a single regenerative currency asset would always remain fixed in value relative to a quantifiable measurement of essential need-fulfilling work, but higher prices could still be charged relative to these standard units for more valuable purchases while still cohering with this metric and preventing inflation. And by being someone who makes these kinds of elective sales, you can empower the providers of essential work. In fact, earning wealth can become a generous act. Now, earning a regenerative currency can be a generous act because regenerative currencies mirror the social function of gratitude. Gratitude is one of the most healthy and beneficial sources of social pressures within human communities, and regenerative currency systems are made to cultivate these same social dynamics. If you hold a regenerative currency, you hold measurable evidence of the presence of real value. It shows that you, through either providing basic services or supporting those who do, have contributed to the well-being of the larger community. You hold assets that symbolize the presence of real value along with the community's gratitude. And anyone who is actually grateful for this essential work can offer meaningful value to show their thanks. In other words, they can accept regenerative currencies while making meaningful sales. Now, it's important to visualize what this would practically look like. So here's a snapshot from a participating individual's day. So let's say you're hungry for breakfast, you go out to a local restaurant, you eat your fill, and you leave without having to pay. In between everything else you do that day, you happen to make some art, you post about it online, put it up for sale, and someone reaches out wanting to buy it, and it's the chef who fed you for free. And they can pay you using the regenerative currency assets that they made by feeding you. You put in your time and your work to creating the art, and now you can go spend the money that you earned by doing so. Now, this is more than a bit simplified, because actually anyone could sell their products and services to that chef. It wouldn't have to be you. Then that person would hold the usable wealth that has been produced by sustaining your life. And this is actually pretty intuitive too. It's very similar to existing financial systems, except that producing essential value actually produces financial value in a regenerative currency system, rather than the conventional approach where the production of real value always comes at a cost. Using this model, the production of real value can always be more profitable than exploiting communities in need or ignoring that they actually have high levels of need. And we have to hop into the subject of choice surrounding any digital currency, taxes. So how would the use of regenerative currency assets be taxed? Actually, this model comes with some excitingly convenient solutions for public funding. The first is that the natural decay of a regenerative currency as real value leaves circulation can take the place of many taxes that would otherwise be used to serve these same goals that are now being funded by new currency generation. Conventional taxes could become much lower in all of the areas where they currently serve to compensate for entropy. And the second solution for public funding addresses goals that might not otherwise be targets of currency generation, but are important pieces of our public systems, and that's to use transaction fees. It's really important to note that quarterly or yearly taxation wouldn't be relevant for these currencies, at least it would be logistically very difficult because they decay over time. So instead of these quarterly or yearly approaches to taxation, I recommend the use of transaction fees that automatically take a small piece of every exchange that uses a regenerative currency and deposits it into a public pool. This pool could be held by any relevant governing body and could be used as a substitute for public income that might otherwise be lost as people shift into the use of alternative media of exchange. This can enable public-private partnerships between governments and the implementers of regenerative currency systems, even multiple regenerative currency systems at the same time, while also radically streamlining the public's experience of paying taxes. Some governments may directly choose to create their own regenerative currencies as well, and the targets for new currency generation could then be the same as the targets for public funding from transaction fees. Public funding could then be drawn flexibly from either static or circulating sources, making it possible to balance levels of circulation by changing levels of friction within exchanges. Transaction fees could be increased while lowering currency decay and increasing wealth longevity. This could introduce friction to exchanges while simultaneously encouraging savings. On the other hand, transaction fees could be lowered in favor of higher rates of decay, and then buying pressure would be encouraged and friction within exchanges would be reduced. I won't get too far into technical details, but small fees might actually already be an important part of successfully making a digital currency that decays over time. One way of making a regenerative currency decay over time is to attach a timestamp to each asset that determines its usable value. Old code could then stack up and accrue as regenerative currencies age, and small fees could be used to keep the code of old assets from accruing indefinitely. Every exchange that's made using regenerative currency could automatically remove a small amount of the oldest code out of circulation before replacing that same amount of value using newly issued code. And if this is already part of the infrastructure of how a regenerative currency system works, transaction fees could pull old code out of circulation and remove it permanently while issuing an equivalent amount of new assets into a centralized pool. And what about the wealth that people already hold and use? How would regenerative currencies relate with existing currencies? Well, an important part of this model is that it would not eliminate the meaningfulness of existing currencies, though some important shifts might take place if people adopt new media of exchange very widely for their day-to-day purchases. Now, you could hold and use both regenerative currencies and existing currencies at the same time, but I believe they would gradually settle into different roles from each other, even without any active regulation. Because regenerative currencies lose value over time, I believe it would make the most sense to spend them first before spending conventional wealth. Conventional currencies, on the other hand, could be held indefinitely, so they can become savings-oriented stores of value. And it should be perfectly possible to purchase a regenerative currency with conventional assets, or purchase conventional financial assets with a regenerative currency, and the exchange rates between these assets could fluctuate. But I believe that conventional currencies would generally be the strongest in these exchanges relative to the benchmark where equivalent purchases could be made. This is because even with a loss in usable value, it would still be financially wise for regenerative currency holders to purchase a lasting store of value if they intend to hold their wealth for an extended period of time. And the holders of stores of value could then purchase regenerative currencies to make their own wealth go further towards their short-term expenses. It's also important to note that any purchase of a conventional store of value would be a taxable event even when you're paying with a regenerative currency. Though regenerative currencies could cover many public costs through their own infrastructure of decay and transaction fees, the purchase of an external store of value would be separate from this, and so that would have to be calculated into the loss that someone is taking when they're purchasing a longer-term store of wealth. The overall result of all of this would be to add a new layer into existing economies. Regenerative currency systems could be an optional tool for groups and communities that want to introduce this new layer. Conventional currencies would retain their usability in whatever communities choose to prefer them, and for as long as they continue to be preferred. But any decentralized collective choice to move towards the wide adoption of regenerative currencies would gradually shift public funding and most daily exchanges towards the use of regenerative currencies, while conventional currencies would change their role towards being a store of value, an asset for holding longer-term savings. Conventional currencies may in fact increase in value over time if they cease to be introduced. While regenerative currencies become more abundant relative to them, the supply of a conventional currency would remain steady or drop over time, and this could allow its price to increase. What this means is that people who are already stakeholders in existing financial systems wouldn't have to worry about losing the wealth that they've already spent so much time and effort earning. In fact, they may find that their existing wealth gains value over time as regenerative currency systems scale. All right, so taking a step back and a deep breath, we get to step aside from the technical details of these systems for the time being. The whole point of a regenerative currency system is to make it so that people have access to basic well-being, and to make it so that the planet can be a thriving, resilient living system indefinitely, even alongside healthy systems of commerce. Let's set our inner compasses to these priorities of social and ecological well-being, these real forms of value. We can't let money decide what our priorities, actions, and decisions should be. We've seen what happens when we try that. With the tools presented in this model, we have every ability to make our financial systems align with our value systems. We can eliminate poverty. We can protect the planet. We can make money better. Thank you so much for listening. You can lead and join a decentralized global conversation on regenerative currency systems at the hashtag MakeMoneyBetter. You can learn more about this model at makemoneybetter.com with little hyphens in there, and you can support my work through my Patreon page. Links can be found in the description of this video.